Lesson 2 of Chapter 6 deals with the growth of colonial resistance to the laws that were being passed by English Parliament throughout the 1760s and into the 1770s. After all the problems with the Stamp and Sugar Acts, Great Britain was looking to improve their relationship with the colonies. They also were looking for solutions for paying off the war debt that was left over from the French and Indian War. The King's finance minister, Charles Townshend, believed he had a solution to England's debt problem. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. The first part of the Townshend Acts was to suspend New York's colonial assembly until they agreed to pay for the English regulars that were stationed in New York. But that's not the important part for us. What is important is what we kind of see here in the picture on our screen in front of us. That was the tax on glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. Townshend believes that these taxes, which were collected on the goods before they entered the colony, so they were actually increased the goods while they were on the docks in England, the price of the goods, and then they shipped them to the colonies with the higher prices, that these taxes would be less offensive to the colonists than the direct taxes of the Stamp Act. To help enforce the Townshend Acts, British officers would be given writs of assistance, which were essentially today kind of like what we would call our search warrants, so that soldiers could enter people's homes in search of smuggled goods. And these search warrants were passed out pretty liberally. You could get them pretty easily, unlike today where you have to have some kind of proof or cause that a crime has been committed in order to get a search warrant. Now, naturally, these taxes were just as unpopular as the earlier taxes in the colonies, and the colonists, they kind of organized several different ways that they were going to handle this or protest it. And they began as soon as the laws were passed by Parliament. In New York, people were angry because their colonial assemblies were suspended. Also, a tax that would increase the price of imports had direct impact on the merchants who were living in New York City. New York was a big port city, and a lot of people, that's how they made their living. They relied on those imported goods for survival. The problem for many of the colonists wasn't the fact that the Parliament wanted to tax its citizens living in America, but the fact that they were taxed without their consent. One prominent Pennsylvanian lawyer named John Dickinson said the issue was whether Parliament can legally take money out of our pockets without our consent. Other colonists were angry about the writs of assistance. James Otis, who we know coined the phrase "no taxation without representation," argued that the writs of assistance went against their natural rights, and we know that those rights were discussed by John Locke. Colonists like Otis believed that the Townshend Acts were a serious threat to the freedoms and rights of all Englishmen. In the fall of 1767, the merchants of Boston announced a boycott of British goods. Samuel Adams, who is seen here in the picture towards the bottom center of the screen, he was one of these leaders of the boycotts, one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts, and he was a driving force. He was very vocal. We saw in the John Adams video how vocal he was, yelling at the guys from the Boston Massacre that they were murderers and kind of rallying support around his cause. He was going to be the mouthpiece and lead these efforts. Soon the boycott of English goods had spread throughout all the other colonies. The Sons used their influence in order to force shopkeepers and merchants from purchasing the goods imported from England. Now, the last picture that's here on this slide, up in the upper left-hand corner, really represents the members of the Daughters of Liberty. These were the women of the colonies who, they had to kind of pick up the slack and make a lot of the goods that had previously been imported from England, such as woven cloth and candles. As a result, trade with Britain declined sharply, and it would have major implications for British merchants who made money through colonial trade. In 1768, another 1,000 British regulars, or redcoats, arrived in Boston under the command of General Thomas Gage. As I mentioned in class, the soldiers were very poorly paid by the English government, and they often found other jobs in the colonies, working on docks or whatever, in order to supplement their military salary. They would typically work for a cheaper rate than the colonists would, so they would be the first persons that would be hired for jobs rather than colonists who were looking for jobs. And this caused a lot of tension. There was a lot of yelling back and forth and arguing and a lot of anger between the regulars who were stationed there in Massachusetts, who really they didn't have a whole lot of say. They were just there doing their jobs. And the colonists who felt that their rights were being infringed upon. By the time we get to the spring of 1770, the tensions are ready to boil over, and they do. Colonists and redcoats, at this point, they're calling each other names, and things are going to spill over into violence. When a group of dock workers and youths who had been taunting the regulars assigned to guard a British customs house, that's the place where the taxes are collected, started a fight. It started with snowballs, and then other things were being thrown, and shots were fired. Whenever the smoke cleared, there were 5 colonists who had been killed, one of which was a former runaway slave named Crispus Attucks, whose picture you can see on page 147. The Sons of Liberty members, such as Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, they called the shooting the Boston Massacre. They said that the 4 dock workers had given their lives for freedom, and therefore they were martyrs. And Revere engraved the poster that's seen on page 149 of your textbook. And it was really designed to enrage the other colonists. We're going to take a look at that picture here in just a second on the other slide, but I wanted to point out on this slide here, I found this picture, which I like much better, representing our 5 dead colonists. We have our coffins in the middle. We have our muskets. We have the snowball up in the upper left-hand corner that the colonists said started it. We have the musket balls. The Liberty Bell is being rung down in the bottom left-hand corner. 3-5 represents the month and day of 1770. March 5th, 1770 is when it took place. And finally, the punishment, which we'll get to here in just a second. The guys the only punishment that the soldiers received was an M being branded on their thumb for manslaughter. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide and talk a little bit about the trial. The soldiers who were involved in the Boston Massacre, they were put on trial in Massachusetts. They were unable to find a lawyer or counsel, and they basically had to beg John Adams to take the case. And again, this is something that we saw that was very clearly and accurately portrayed in the video that we watched, where they convinced John Adams to take the case. Adams took the case because, number one, he was a very principled man. He was determined to demonstrate that everybody in America could receive a fair trial, regardless of how heinous the crime may or may not have been. And this was one of those cases that if this happened in England, chances are the people who had committed the crime would not have been able to receive a fair trial. But here in the colonies, Adams had set out to make sure that they did. At the end, and again, we saw this on TV, the evidence suggested that the soldiers were innocent. The jury found them innocent, and the soldiers were acquitted of their crimes. Their only punishment was, again, the branding. For 2 of the guys that had branding on their thumbs, a capital M for manslaughter. This didn't make Adams the most popular man in Massachusetts, but he will regain some of his popularity, and he will move from being more of a moderate revolutionary, somebody who's kind of cool to the tactics that are being employed by his cousin Samuel Adams, to someone who is more of a revolutionary, who's more on the side of the colonists as time goes on, and as we see after the Tea Act and the Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts, which will be coming up in the next lesson. Use this video to study for the test. It's coming up, and hopefully this provided you with a good review.